Welcome to The Tea, the show where we go beyond the headlines to tell you the story behind the stories, serving up what really matters. I'm your host, Myriam Francois. This week, we're looking at the connections between AI, big tech, and warfare. When you hear AI warfare, you might picture killer robots straight out of a sci-fi movie. But Israel's assault on Gaza shows the real nightmare isn't sci-fi. It's how the surveillance tech creeping into all our lives is being weaponized to create murder on a mass scale, with little regard for civilian casualties and real questions over accountability. And Gaza and Ukraine are the current testing labs for the $2.3 trillion global arms industry. Joining us today is Dr. Mahmoudi, a leading tech expert at Amnesty International and assistant professor at Cambridge University, whose research focuses on AI surveillance, digital control, and resistance. Matt, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here with us. I guess, first of all, I wanted to ask you about how do you become an AI tech expert? And perhaps more to the point, I would expect that with your skill set, you could have gone to work for Google, Apple, all of the big tech companies, and instead you chose to work at Amnesty. Tell me a little bit about your story.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of pathways for anyone who comes out of, especially an immigrant background, where the sort of promised land is often posited as tech. You go into tech, you get a job, you become a programmer, and you're set. You can look after your community, you can look after sort of the dream that your parents came to the country with, right? And so for me, that was very much the driving force initially, until I figured that actually a lot of the ways in which some of the technology products that we all deal with on an everyday basis were wound up with some of the very sort of problems that my family were experiencing themselves coming into Denmark as refugees. And so that, combined with a growing politicization in the aftermath of 9/11, drove me into a very different direction. And I think for me, it was predominantly looking at the ways in which tech companies benefited off of keeping migrant communities in positions of precarity and positions in which they could be exploited. And that took me into this direction of exploring the lived realities and effects of AI technologies and technology products like the ones we'll be talking about today. And many years later, I'm at Amnesty. Yeah.
And which is how you also dedicate, I guess, your first book to the subjects which presumably are very close to your heart, to your personal experience. So I came to want to talk about this subject through a conference I went to in Helsinki recently, which was looking at exactly these subjects. I'm not a specialist in this area, but I have to say I was deeply shocked by what I learned at this symposium. And it seems to me that we, as the wider population, the non-tech people, blissfully unaware of the dangers that surround this field. And I don't want to scaremonger, because of obviously with all tech, there's positives and negatives to be taken. But let's talk about the fact for a start that, you know, in Gaza in particular, we are seeing the use of AI tech at an unprecedented level. And the scholar Anthony Lowenstein has spoken about in his book, you know, the Palestine laboratory, this idea weapons are being tested in Gaza, that Gaza today is a testing lab for the weapons industry. Can you tell us a little bit about that concept? What is being done to this population?
Yeah. So the Gazan population of Palestinians are effectively experiencing what has been the culmination of decades and decades of testing and surveillance on their bodies towards the end of control, really. So Israeli authorities have, since the, at least 80s or 90s, Palestinians into systems that made it easier for them, as it were, to keep track of where Palestinians are, who their family members are, who they sort of come and go with, and where their property is situated, whether it's a car, whether it's a home, in an effort to reinforce the kinds of restrictions on the human body to move in space that is tantamount to apartheid, right? And really, that's where it starts. And it goes even further back. If we have to really historicize it, you could take it back to the pre-1948 period and look at the ways in which early intelligence operators of what became Israel were involved in really developing what was known as the village files, which was this large, again, database, analog database of information on where Palestinians were and where they would be, in an effort to make it easier and streamline the process of actually removing them and displacing them as a part of what we now know as the Nakba. But what we've seen since the 80s and 90s is these systems of databasing being put on steroids, right? These systems help enable Israeli authorities to find out where Palestinians are, where Hamas operatives are, where combatants are, figure out where they come and go, where their family members are, and generating lists that enable them to posture to the international community that these are legitimate military targets because they've used AI to find them. And then we've seen the airstrikes that follows, the over 40,000 Palestinians killed, and the subsequent erasure of the entirety of Gaza at this stage.
And I suppose what struck me as particularly nefarious as I started to look into this was the connections between the huge monetary value of this industry and the use of that technology in these warfare settings. On one hand, of course, there is a security excuse being wielded, but simultaneously, Israel is the 9th largest exporter of this type of military tech. It's an incredibly valuable industry. And so in many ways, there is a confluence of interest, one might say, between the development of this mass surveillance warfare in view of testing ever more effective violent technologies and an industry that's built on making money off of that.
Yeah, that's right. Palestinians are sort of the ideal subject in this situation, right? They're a group who are so perfectly positioned in terms of how we talk about them and how we talk about, especially as it were, Palestinian combatants and terrorists and whatever, as a way of framing sort of a perfect population for whom to develop these technologies, right? Against whom to develop these technologies. And well, if it works against Palestinians who are a threat, apparently, to the state of Israel, then they will work against terrorists elsewhere. They will work against unruly, undocumented immigrants elsewhere. They will work against black people protesting in the streets, putting up a fight against the murder of George Floyd, right? So it's the sort of making the connection that actually what we're witnessing is the construction of an idealized threat who justifies any number of contraventions of international law aside, but really ethical and moral flexibilities that allow for the creation of the technologies that help first database, surveil them, track their every move, track their families' movements, and subsequently to maim and kill them.
The kind of brazenness with which this is being touted, I think, is partly what's so shocking, right? So I was reading that back in November, there was an Israeli defense startup which was posting a photo of soldiers on Facebook using one of their new systems, sort of, celebrating this as a breakthrough. And the CEO of that same company was describing the assault on Gaza as a sales boost. We hear stories of the effectiveness of this weaponry. Effectiveness in a context where 70% of the deaths are attributed to civilians are being used as marketing ploys in arms sales fairs. I mean, is that the situation? Is that where we're at, Matt?
We're witnessing a situation in which being able to claim any number of deaths as having been generated by an AI system or by a data-intensive system somehow automatically leads us to saying, well, that's okay, that's legitimate, that's an effective system because it was a part of the decision to kill. Right. But we have to ask ourselves the question, how was that decision arrived at in the first place? What processes did the system need to go through? What processes were omitted in order to arrive at that decision to maim or kill? And insofar as we stop asking those questions, what the industry will rely on is just this idea that we're mesmerized by AI, whatever shape it takes. At an everyday level, we see ChatGPT, we see DALL-E, we see Midjourney, we see all these fantastical AI products that are able to do things allegedly faster than we can as human beings, or so they claim. And so we're drawn in by that idea in the first place. We don't look under the hood. We're not told what's under the hood. We're not told that it's on the basis of much of the labor and data that we've had taken from us in the first place. Leaving that aside, that mesmerization and that sort of fantastical attraction to these technologies in the first place means that when governments like the Israeli authorities come along and say, well, we're using similar technology that from your everyday to accomplish these great wonders in warfare, we go, well, it's got to be legit, because I've seen these technologies, and I believe ChatGPT is generating a full-on article for me that looks legitimate.
And I might even believe that AI is smarter than me.
Exactly.
I might even believe that ChatGPT is smarter than I am.
Right.
So if they are generating this, then it must be better than what any human can generate.
Right.
And also there is this weird, let's face it, mythology around science and progress in Western societies, right?
Yep.
The idea that anything that is empirically grounded must be truth with a capital T.
Yeah.
And I wonder how much of that is fueling this it's almost like a mystical belief in the ability of AI to generate a better world, forgetting that there are people, right, behind the AI.
And the hilarious part of that is that so much of this narrative is otherwise rooted in this hyper rationality and this hyper scientific aspect of it, that you've managed to almost make it a lab-like automated process to find out who is a combatant and who isn't. But actually the draw in and the attachment to the idea that the system can do it is like deeply religious, and it's deeply ideological. And this is the part where we forget. And so I do think, as audience members, as people who are generally concerned, it's so important to ask, well, how were these decisions made? What was the data that was used? Actually, where was that drawn from? How can a system know whether somebody is a combatant? What kind of mathematical formula do I need to apply to my family members or to my friends to figure out if they may be combatants too? It's just a ridiculous question to ask. And once you start asking those questions, you realize there's no way that an AI is capable of answering.
And even scarier, you might say, do we want an equation to answer that question? Because I don't. I would rather there was somebody maybe that kind of saw what the equation provided, but was still thinking for themselves. Well, that might make sense in a very purely logical sense, but reality is far more complex than that. You mentioned kind of questioning where some of this underlying information, because these AI systems are built on essentially the cross-pollination of analytics, right? It's the analysis of big bodies of data that are sort of put together. So this is me talking in very baby terms, cross-referencing big bodies of data and then coming up with formulas based on, relatively smart people figuring out that this would make sense. But one of the areas that I think is really underplayed is the connection between mass surveillance and the types of AI technologies that we're seeing deployed. Yep. And I say this because would I be right in saying that we would not be seeing the types of tech deployed in Gaza today were it not to have been preceded by the sort of mass surveillance that the Palestinian population have endured? And I would love for you to connect that to us to the wider mass surveillance that we are all gradually being habituated to.
Yeah, no, that's entirely correct. So the oil, the raw materials that make these systems function in the first place are entirely based on data that has been extracted from Palestinians unlawfully against their will as a part of the apartheid system, as a part of the ongoing crime of apartheid that has been committed by Israeli authorities. And what we're seeing is a sort of a databasing that goes as widely to where people have family members, to, as I sort of talked about before, what sort of vehicle they own, what property they might own, and also relationally ties to folks that they might be somehow in relation to, even if it's not a direct family member. For example, were they a part of a group that protested somewhere and then somebody else happened to be there on that day? They might be tied together in a database too. So then years later, you can build AI systems that sit on top of them and make decisions as to whether somebody is likely to be a combatant. But the real troublesome dynamic here is one that emerges where you start to see that the variables that are used in order to make a decision about whether somebody is a combatant or not, about whether somebody is deviant or has engaged in some form of criminality, those variables are often super arbitrary. They're drawn out of thin air or through proxies of proxies of proxies. Like you might draw on pictures that have been collected through the social media profile of somebody who has a profile in one of these databases. And one of those pictures might show that they are at a health facility in Gaza. And the system will say, well, the health facility in Gaza is run by Hamas. And so naturally, this person being at a health facility may therefore be connected to Hamas. And as a result, they become a target.
Our infamous Hamas-run health infrastructure, the way in which, the very obvious reality that because Hamas has been running the Gaza Strip, that all government institutions are effectively Hamas run. So if we think about that in the context of the databases and the cross-referencing of this data, you're essentially saying that anyone that ever frequented a government-run institution could be, tabulated as, on one of these hit lists.
Yeah, that's the fallacy of drawing on this narrative in the first place, and the sort of the complicity of the media in generating a narrative that sets that up as plausible, and B, it's the fallacy of relying on systems of mass surveillance in the first place that rely on these anecdotal pieces of information to draw grander truth about individuals that can be contextual, that can be circumstantial, that can have a far deeper or even more shallow explanation than an AI system is able to parse. And so hence the importance of, even where systems, as much as I'm against them, like these are being used in a military context or elsewhere, it is so important that it isn't the decision maker, that the decision maker and the person who is making the choice to engage in that information is a real human being with contextual awareness and with the ability to see through some of these problems. However, going back to the sort of like religious ideological attachment to AI, we've seen in numerous studies going back to even 2018, some of the work that Virginia Eubanks did looking at how caseworkers in child protective services made decisions to remove children or not based on an algorithm. You see how caseworkers and people in general are drawn to what the computer says more so to their own intuition and expertise. Wow. As soon as they see an indicator that visually tells them something is a threat, they are afraid of making the decision themselves because they could be prosecuted, they could be liable, and so they absolve responsibility to the system. But in a context like Gaza, in a context which we've seen, as per the ICJ, is a plausible genocide that is only worsening by the day, and that's now expanded into Lebanon as well and beyond. You do not want a system making decisions. You do not want a system making these decisions, systems that have been built in a context that's itself, on the one hand, in violation of international law, not just from the mass surveillance, which is also unlawful, but also in the ways that it continues to violate the right to life of Palestinians up and down the Palestinian territories. These systems will reflect that desire and that sort of objective in continuous eradication.
I'm wondering to what extent we tend to think of these problems as things that are happening over there. One of my friends came out of Gaza and he was telling me that he has to play the sound of a drone in his room at night because his entire life there have been the sound of drones. So most people may not know this, but the background sound to everybody's life in Gaza is the buzzing of these drones, right? And it's constant 24/7. He's never known a reality without that sound. And I thought to myself, okay, well, that's a very extreme situation. And then I was sort of reading the other day, of course, about Amazon planning to deliver us our packages increasingly through drones, where presumably it would be the same facial technology that's being used in Gaza to assess whether you are a quote unquote terrorist and execute you, because these are quadricopters, right, armed with sniper guns that, literally make an assessment and then shoot you dead, including children in some cases. That those technologies are now being deployed in our contexts, and we are accepting them out of a sense of comfort and ease. And I wonder, Matt, whether you feel we are not just being habituated to a level of mass surveillance that reminds me of the sort of frog in the pot of boiling water, right? Years ago, we were up in arms about security cameras on street corners, and now we are in one of the most surveyed countries in the world, right? Is this the direction of travel? Should people be alert to the fact that we are witnessing the deployment of mass surveillance technologies, which in the context of warfare can lead to mass casualties, But that does not preclude them being used in extremely nefarious ways, even closer to home.
Precisely. I mean, you're bringing this home. In a sense, the best anecdote that I can bring here is the taser drone. Have you heard about the taser drone? It's a curse from your nightmare. Basically, it's a drone. It's a quadricopter that's been equipped with a taser gun, and it's situated itself as something that police forces can use in the U.S. and the UK. It comes on the back of much of the sort of early thinking around the robo-dogs that you might have seen Boston Dynamics. Yeah, terrifying. And they were deployed in New York for a while by the NYPD, but they were resisted and they were then taken off the streets. But the quadricopters that have taser guns, I think, is a really good example for the direction of travel. You have facial recognition becoming more and more palatable or normalized in our everyday. We forget that in order for these systems to function, they must have collected mass surveillance data on each and every one of us, non-consensually, without our knowledge, often from social media profiles, often from government registries where you did not give consent for your information to be used for policing or for tracking down your movements at a protest. But that action, that process of creating that database is what allows the facial recognition systems to function, systems that we're no longer against, really, on the one hand. And then secondly, we've got the emergence of robotics that is increasingly playing a role in policing. Again, with the robo-dogs, with the quadricopters, we see more and more tech companies seeping into government function. You and I have previously talked about Palantir and the presence of Palantir in the NHS.
And I want to come back to Palantir. We will come back to Palantir.
Yes. And we see how the sort of handshake between governments and tech companies in Silicon Valley, together with the sort of hyper-normalization of surveillance in society and the excitement positively with AI, means that there is this confluence that allows for the worst possible scenarios to emerge, and we won't realize it until we're in a situation where we're protesting on the streets and quadricopters are being used against us, either to tase us or to identify us or to identify our family members or to in other ways shrink the civic space that we have to protest and resist.
So I am so glad you raised that, because I was recently reading about the fact that the American facial recognition company Clearview AI recently overturned a £7.5 million fine from the regulator for unlawfully storing more than 20 billion images of people's faces. Okay, so I take this information to my friends as a sort of testing ground, and they're like, well, I put pictures of myself up on the internet all the time, and so like, why is this even a big deal? Why is it a big deal, Matt? Should we care that these big US companies are storing billions of pictures of us, even if we are putting those pictures up online anyway?
I wonder if those friends would protest against their images being used to create deepfakes, because it's exactly the same process. We're talking about a perverse violation of consent, where images are being taken that were supposed to be used for one purpose, and that is for you to share with your friends and your families for leisure, not for policing, not for surveillance, not for deepfakes to be created on the basis of them. But the fact that there is that same infringement of that right to privacy, that same infringement of your bodily autonomy, because you're no longer in control of who gets to see your biometric fingerprint and who gets to use it, that is a massive problem. And that's why we've seen data protection authorities fine Clearview AI for this 20 billion and now upwards of 30 billion faces that they claim to have access to. And they know that they're transgressive, right? It's their whole model. They sell it as not caring about privacy because they want to equip police forces with these technologies. And all too often, police forces are looking for quick fixes to issues around efficiency and being able to posture that they're doing their jobs right. And so they turn to tech. But little do they know that whilst now they might not be paying very much for Clearview services, when people realize that these technologies are infringing on them perversely, there will be lawsuits, there will be massive losses, and there will be massive costs to the taxpayer.
And the issue is that by then we have created a form of dependence on those analytics and on those systems, which make it very difficult to extract ourselves from them, right? Once they're already in place. I think the other thing that's interesting to me is that I think most people tend to think of sort of surveillance as being a problem that only affects the bad people. You know, it's like, well, I'm not doing anything wrong. Like, why would I care if somebody's listening in on my phone? Or why why would I care if somebody's listening in on my emails? And I would, love to put to you the case of the UAE and following the normalization deal with Israel, their use of Pegasus technology to spy on one of the last standing human rights campaigners in the country, Ahmed Mansour, who was imprisoned for over 10 years for, injury to the image of the state or some other kind of BS, which was taken from phone hacking using this Israeli tech. Do you think that the public at large continues to misunderstand the extent to which the surveillance technologies are being used to get the bad guys?
I think we're drinking the Kool-Aid, maybe too liberally buying into the snake oil that is AI and sophisticated technologies of surveillance. All too often, we see the narrative that these technologies can be used to reduce criminality, to find people that are agitators. We've recently started to have a bit more of an awareness following some of the Pegasus revelations that human rights defenders are being targeted, that journalists are being targeted. And what's more is that it's when politicians are targeted by these systems themselves, unbeknownst to them, that it becomes a problem, right? And you put it on the agenda. Oh, shoot, this is not what we expected. The tools that we initially may have rubber stamped for being used against the sort of deviant population are now being used against us. And what that narrative up until this moment has done is create sort of a web of impunity, as it were, around the technology companies, many of which have emerged from the Israeli context or have at least been tested within the Israeli context. In fact, many of these technologies, some of them adjacent to NSO groups' technologies, you'll see at tech expositions being framed as having been combat proven on Palestinians and then sold onwards to other government authorities that end up using them. But what is crucially being missed from all of this is the web of impunity itself allows for the generation and the solidification of a sort of a context in which we no longer can exercise some of the most basic rights, right to protest, our right to freedom of assembly, our right to freedom of expression. Suddenly all of these things become legible and impermissible by AI systems that were trained in a context in which they were supposed to help further marginalize and oppress and automate apartheid against Palestinians, and are now using similar logics, similar ways of detecting deviance and similar ways of detecting the other, but being used at large. So they will affect, in the UK and in the US and elsewhere in the world, they will affect black and brown people. They will affect Muslim people. They will affect some of the most marginalized that are already targeted by some of the most repressive government policies of surveillance to begin with, and put them on steroids. It's your greengrocer. It's your friend who is protesting at the Black Lives Matter protest or who's going to the Gaza protests every Saturday.
And now even the eco-protesters, right?
Precisely.
We're seeing it now, and this is where sort of interestingly, white people are increasingly being affected by these same systems, is that suddenly, I mean, the green movement, which has largely and not exclusively been a more white movement, and we're now seeing, severe sentences handing out to these eco-warriors. And I wonder to what extent that is going to help maybe create an awakening of the ways in which this assumption, as you say, that the state is going after the bad guys, but actually it's the bad guys according to whom.
Yeah,
right.
Precisely.
So we talked about kind of the ways in the surveillance tech is being normalized, and I think more to the point, not just in dictatorships, but also now increasingly across the so-called free world. But I want to come back to how it's being tested in war. Let's talk about the Lavender program, because this was one of the things I learned about recently. There was the report published by 972 Mag earlier this year that revealed that it was responsible for drawing up kill lists of up to 37,000 people with an error rate of 10%, which, guys, is huge. I know, like, people might think, oh, 10%. No, 10% is huge. It's 1 in 10 people, right? That seems to me insane, but it gets worse, right? For every junior Hamas operative that they marked as a target, it was permissible to kill 15 to 20 civilians, that 100 civilians could be killed in the assassination of one single alleged commander. We are sold this idea, Matt, that, AI and tech is making warfare more accurate, more humane, that it's a way to create less civilian casualties. But since 2011, we've only seen a growing number of civilian casualties. So what is going on here?
Yeah, I mean, the 10% really is something to touch base on, because who decided that it was that 10% margin to begin with? The number in actual fact might be a lot larger than what we're given, because there's nobody who is currently freely and independently verifying the systems that are being used by the state of Israel. Nobody has access. In terms of an independent scrutiny of the actual system, there is none.
No one is going under the rubble to check that the people they say they targeted are the people they say they targeted, right?
Precisely.
That's the problem.
Precisely. So there's no way of establishing what the error rate is. So assuming that the error rate is just bogus, that's fronted as a way of selling a system, still you're dealing with a system that sort of emerges in a way that's quite politically expedient, because you've got 37,000 that have been generated with Lavender, but also around the same time you have, just over 37,000 people, Palestinian people, that have been killed in Gaza. That creates a sort of idea that, oh, well, they must have been the targets from the system. Ergo, the system generated military targets. Ergo, everyone who was killed were military targets. Therefore, this is all legitimate.
Right.
But there's no one who, again, is investigating or looking into to what extent these systems in the first place relied on reliable, verifiable, accurate information about who was being targeted, which just means that it becomes sort of AI washing killing, right? It becomes AI washing murder. It becomes AI washing the destruction of Gaza. The ways in which Lavender works is that it relies on vast databases of information on Palestinians, right? Databases that already exist within the state of Israel, but also on social media profiles. Again, we spoke about before the fallacies of relying on proxies for making determinations about who is a combatant. So what you will end up with is an approximation, a probability that somebody maybe is Hamas affiliated in some shape or form. And that is then put into a list. Whilst that list is just a target generation list, it's a list that's supposed to inform decisions. What we know from the reporting is that there was no more than between 20 to 40 seconds taken for making the decision to kill on the back of that list. Yeah.
So this is part of the gospel thing, right? The gospel program that was, it's all about speeding up warfare. And one of the things I was learning at the conference was that, instead of seeing where we are today as a kind of revolution in warfare, it's more like an evolution that we've been seeing. Right? We're wanting to try and make warfare more distant from the target so that we have less impact on our troops. We want to make it more efficient, quote unquote, aka we want to be able to kill more targets with less input. And I wonder to what extent the fact that we cannot test the reliability of the figures that we are being given by official sources who are saying to us, okay, it was 37,000 military targets. But we have a broader figure that is being given to us of civilian casualties, which is of 70% of them being made up of women and children. Yeah. Right? So if we put those together, we say on one hand, the militaries are selling us the idea that their technologies are becoming more accurate, okay, through these AI systems. That's the line. That's the official line we're being sold. And simultaneously, those who are actually keeping tally, not just in the current conflict, but elsewhere, are saying, actually, no, we're seeing more civilian casualties than we have ever before. Is it the case that AI is more accurate, or is it maybe the case that it is designed to kill more civilians? And I know that there's a lot of pushback against this idea that it's designed to kill civilian casualties. But remember, we're talking about in Gaza in particular, a context of wider ethnic cleansing. Yeah. The suggestion that civilian casualties are just collateral, to me, does seem like something we should question.
There's no way of establishing through an AI system or scientifically whether somebody is a combatant or not, right? You and I agree that if we take a strand of my DNA, something, and I, sequence it genomically, like there's nothing that's going to tell you whether I'm a combatant or not. A picture of me being present at a particular building that happens to be Hamas affiliated, because most public buildings in the context of Gaza is not going to tell you whether I'm a combatant or not, right? Me being Palestinian is not going to tell you whether I'm a combatant or not, because it doesn't tell you about my activities. It doesn't tell you about my affiliations. Nothing about this level of information, which is quite intimate information to begin with, is going to tell you whether I'm a combatant or not. So relying on that information to make a probabilistic determination as to whether I'm a combatant or not is not possible. You cannot establish whether someone is a combatant using AI. So then the question becomes, it's not about accuracy. The third sort of system in all of this, which is I think one of the more chilling ones as well, the Where's Daddy system, which looks at alleged combatants returning to their homes before ordering airstrikes on the homes. So then if it's not about accuracy, it becomes about reinforcing particular logics that are at the center of how these systems are developed in the first place.
Which are the ideologies of the militaries that are creating those technologies in the first place.
Precisely.
And Where's Daddy is something I wanted us to take a whole minute to examine, because when I learned about Where's Daddy, I honestly could have broken down just from the perversity of calling a technology that identifies when it's perceived that the male member of a household returns to his household, to his family, so that he can be targeted in that location. That's the tech.
Yeah.
Where's Daddy is about targeting the family.
Yeah.
How can we say it's about targeting the combatant? The whole point of Where's Daddy is you target that person when they get back to their family home, when they get back to their wife and kids.
I think the core of this is just the severe amount of dehumanization of Palestinians in general, because you have to remember that these tools are not just being marketed and named arbitrarily, right? The reporting may tell us that they do certain things and they're called certain things and they may sound like they're secretive, and all credit to the journalists that do this incredible work that allows us to look in behind the hood of some of these systems. But there are also, it's an opportunity for Israeli security forces to position their products and their method of warfare as something that is attractive to countries elsewhere that are also looking to neutralize particularly deviant populations. In the minds of somebody who's sitting in, for example, the US military, you don't have to go very far to imagine that they could go, well, we could use this against terrorists and we could hit them where it hurts at the family level, because there is this profound dehumanization and this profound notion, I think, that's been ingrained that, you know, Palestinians aren't people. They're not ordinary families, because they have to not be in order for this to happen, right? In order for the complete erasure, as it were, of Gaza to happen at the scale that we're currently witnessing.
Right. And I guess the bigger question is that these are technologies being developed by governments who simultaneously pay lip service to the notion of, you know, preserving civilian welfare, of, you know, upholding international law. And we, you know, we can sort of, you know, sigh at the suggestion that they even care about these things. But I'm also really cautious about the idea of dismissing any sort of upholding of these principles as something they have to be held to, because I'm not sure where we go to once they disappear. But I suppose it's the perversity of a tech being sold to governments around the world, which is very, very clearly about targeting families.
Yeah. I mean, that's the core of it, is that in the name is the violation of international law, right? The occupying power, in this case, the Israeli authorities, have a responsibility to also ensure the security of Palestinians,
Right.
not just the security of Israelis. And so any area that's under their de facto occupation is an area in which they owe security and the safety of Palestinians. You do not have a system that considers safety with the sort of reported Where's Daddy system, with the gospel system, with the Lavender system. In fact, a lot of surveillance systems that are developed by Israeli security forces and have been over the last 10, 20 years use names that pretty much give away some of the intention around them. In the West Bank, we've got the Red Wolf system, and we've got the Blue Wolf system that basically incentivizes Israeli officers to go around and take pictures of as many Palestinians as possible to collate a surveillance database that can then be used to figure out who people are when they're being arbitrarily stopped on the streets. Crucially, there was a story by Beit Salem in which they went and documented Israeli security officers showing up in the middle of the night to a family in Hebron, lining them up, 5 children, all minors, taking photos of them, asking them to say cheese as they ransacked their home, and did this intelligence mapping exercise. The Red Wolf system, which is a system that determines whether Palestinians are able to step out of places like Tel Romeda in Hebron, neighborhoods that are residential, to access medical services, to access work, to access education. this system is a facial recognition system that relies on some of the Blue Wolf data to determine whether a Palestinian is able to step out or step in. And whether they're able to do so will be contingent on, does the system flag them for participating in protest? Does it flag them because it simply doesn't recognize them? All of this to say that if you ask Israeli security officers what the name is for, why it's called Blue Wolf and Red Wolf, they'll say it's to find the wolf in sheepskin. Oof. It goes to this quite nefarious, sinister undertone of how these systems are designed in the first place, that they assume deviance, that they assume otherwise evil nature to Palestinians in the ways in which they posture their names and their functions.
It's a system that is built on a presumption of guilt, which is surely fundamentally against any principle that we would want for a system that's regulating a civilian population first and foremost. I want to ask you, therefore, about regulation. Yeah. Look, there have been 83 deaths related to self-driving car accidents in the last 5 years, and there is a hell of a lot of regulation around self-driving cars. How come these AI systems with so much kill power, with so much potential for harm, are seemingly less regulated than self-driving cars?
I think there's a real lack of knowledge and understanding of what particular aspects of AI systems are in violation of international law, which is why a lot of, those of us who work in advocacy organizations have had a lot of work over the last year or two, especially after...
Do you mean lack of knowledge, by governments or by people?
The lack of knowledge by governments.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, truly, I think governments are sold this idea of an efficient, effective system that can do X, Y, Z. They don't necessarily understand the ways in which it sucks up particular forms of data that is in violation of their own laws.
I think the Israelis are not aware that their tech is in, non-conformity, to put it mildly, with international regulation?
Oh, I think they're aware. I think they would argue that, they're using a security justification to effectively shirk any responsibility or need to uphold particular aspects of international law. And they'll see that as proportionate, right? They'll say that it's proportionate for us to evoke the right to privacy, the right to life, the right to freedom of movement of Palestinians because we have an immediate security threat to Israelis.
I did not realize that was optional.
Nah, it's not optional. It's absolutely supposed to be present at all times in war and in peacetime. It does not matter. But when it comes to government elsewhere, I mean, our own government here, even with basic things like facial recognition, there is a lack of real understanding that it depends on that reference database in order to function. Talked about how it needed to scrape your information without your knowledge and consent in order to function. But you'll go, to a House of Lords committee or a House of Commons committee, and you'll talk to policymakers who have key voices on this debate, and it'll be the first time that they hear that it depends on mass surveillance, that a mass surveillance tool depends on mass surveillance to begin with in order to function.
That's terrifying. And I want to come back to the extent to which that is having reverberations in our lives, because, Palantir will be an example of this that we should discuss. But before we get to that, I want to talk to you about the connection between AI systems and the big tech companies that we all rely on, right? Because I think this is definitely an area that people are not aware of. How would you summarize the relationship between the AI being developed in the context of warfare, in the Gaza laboratory, in the Ukraine laboratories, in these border control laboratories, and the companies we all know and love, Amazon, Google, Airbnb, Uber, etc.
Yeah. I mean, there's a relationship there insofar as having created this dependency in the mainstream of how we deal with the small conveniences that they bring to our lives. Not always small, sometimes fairly major. Google search engine is a fairly major convenience. It's also a way of culminating and giving access to knowledge in a way that hasn't been previously possible. That contingency, that dependency in the first place creates the sort of, as it were, inability to look past that immediate convenience. And what it does is that it enables them also on the basis of the popularity of these, very highly consumed products that they develop to scale up and operate and create other products such as the Nimbus products that we've heard about.
So tell people who might not be aware of Nimbus, because to me, the most shocking part of this is not just what you're about to tell us, but that it was, being developed in the middle of assaults on Gaza.
Yeah. So the Nimbus project, which is developed by Amazon and Google, we heard reports about it actually going back to 2020, that it was a conversation that was being had, is effectively a cloud computing interface that's supposed to enable Israeli authorities to gain access to basically apps that enable fast processing of different types of objectives and tasks, including but not limited to facial recognition, target generation, predictive analytics, systems that a military often depends on for things ranging from target generation to surveillance. Now, we don't know exactly what functions and what tools specifically were accessed through the cloud computing interface, but these are some of the options, and you don't have to go very far or do a very complex mathematical equation to understand that scaling up the ability to plug and play apps like that in a context of the ongoing, unfolding genocide in Gaza is likely on the basis of these tools and is likely to generate devastating outcomes, right?
So they're facilitating apartheid at the very least, right? They're providing more efficient systems for the Israelis to be able to undertake apartheid and expansionist policies in contravention of international law. And we all know this, right? I mean, the contract that was signed was, over $1 billion. This was not an under the table deal. This was in the middle of an assault that was widely understood to be in contravention of international law. I'm a little baffled that this is happening in plain sight, but maybe I shouldn't be.
I guess the key issue here is that so much of what was going on with Nimbus wasn't actually being reported until Gaza erupted, essentially. Like, Nimbus was a project that had been pitched a couple of years before and that was being developed, but it wasn't until some of the reporting coming out of The Intercept by Sam Biddle that showed the procurement deal between Israeli authorities and Google and Amazon, that showed also a double lock-in where Israeli authorities have to buy cloud computing products from Google and Amazon. They're not allowed to buy from elsewhere. So that, draws quite a strong conclusion between what they might be enabling. But it's not until that moment in which we start to really see at scale, and until the moment where tech workers themselves working for these companies are starting to come out and speak about their products potentially being wound up with contributing to genocide. That,
God bless the whistleblowers.
Right. Well, they're a big part of it, right? And I think that's where things start to shift, and where Google and Amazon and other big tech companies have to do some serious risk assessment when it comes to figuring out whether it is no longer or is possible to continue palatably with these deals. Because that's the assessment that goes on in a tech company. It's not whether the deal in itself is unlawful or unethical to begin with, is the extent to which it might cause reputational damage.
God, that's so
in the
depressing.
long run. It's really bleak.
But in the context of the wider international prosecution of, states complicit in the genocide, starting, of course, with Israel, but anyone supporting the genocide, whether it's media institutions, I'm wondering, could tech institutions see themselves being, hauled up in front of the International Criminal Court, accused of complicity in the genocide and actually be criminalized for their participation in facilitating this?
Yes, they can. We need to shift our paradigm of how we talk about tech companies and their complicity and contributions to begin with in order for that to happen, but it's possible. Without getting too technical, how we usually talk about human rights violations committed by tech companies is to rely on what's called the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. What they are essentially just a set of recommendations, responsibilities that we say that tech companies have in order to ensure that human rights violations aren't occurring along their supply chain and the life cycle of the products that they provide.
And is we here international human rights organizations, or we the people, or who do you mean?
We the people and human rights organizations. But what we know is that these responsibilities, again, they're optional to some extent. We as human rights advocates would say that they're not, and you still have to ensure that your products align with them, but there's no way of actually enforcing them to begin with.
Unless someone picks up a lawsuit and decides to bring one against you, surely.
Right. But that has to be on the basis of not just responsibilities, but what we know as obligations and legal statutes within international law.
Okay.
And that is where the Genocide Convention comes in. And so what we know from the provisional measures that were released by the International Court of Justice early this year, as well as from the advisory opinion that advised that the occupation as well as the ongoing apartheid in Palestine was unlawful, is that countries, including third-party countries that are not directly involved in the genocide, have a duty to ensure that companies that are domiciled within their jurisdiction are not contributing to economic activity that could exacerbate or contribute to the genocide. And so that's where really this becomes a strong tool. So the more we rely on pushing our governments and pushing our policymakers and MPs, the more we tell them that, look, this is actually a state responsibility thing. It is your responsibility to ensure that Google, who is also domiciled here, at least one of their offices, and many of these other companies that are domiciled here, are not contributing to an exacerbation of the situation in Gaza.
Yeah.
That's when that starts to have power, because then the state itself can also start referring these companies, for example, to the International Court of Justice.
So you mentioned kind of the people working through governments, which, we would hope would be the most effective way to bring accountability to these large organizations that we all rely on, which has been referred to previously as tech feudalism, where basically we now all don't have a choice to kind of operate through them,
right.
Question mark. But I do want to raise the question around the ineptitude of governments in this regard, in their assessment of the connections that we're making even in this conversation between AI and forms of unlawful killings and technologies that are based on essentially the development of technologies of mass extermination. Let's be honest, that is what we are talking about here. Let's talk about Palantir now then. If you're in the UK, you'll know them as the billion-dollar tech firm that handed our government medical data for £1.
That's right.
Why did we hand over medical data to what's been described as the scariest of American tech giants for £1?
Companies like Palantir will often sell their products for very little in order to be able to create a much bigger list of clients that they can then claim are involved with them, right?
So they did this to governments around the world, right?
Yeah.
But which it could also be interpreted, on one hand, as a smart, move for a company to, as you say, just make itself look bigger and efficient than it is.
Right.
But it could also be seen as a huge data grab, right? Because the one thing we've learned from the sort of big revelations that have come out on Facebook and Meta, it's the data that's valuable. So we may have thought, oh, we're getting a great deal here, £1 in exchange for all this data. But who got the great deal here, technically?
Yeah. It's certainly the tech companies, right? What you've ended up doing is that you as a government have essentially sat there, devalued the data and the privacy of your citizens and anyone who reside within your borders. And you've then helped revalue and appreciate the value of the companies to whom you're giving that data, because those things are directly related to one another. What ends up happening is also that you're ceding control of how healthcare governance happens in this country to a tech company who will develop dependencies effectively within the institutions of the NHS here in the UK. So what you will end up seeing is that suddenly the entirety of the infrastructure is adjusted specifically for the tools that Palantir are providing. And so when Palantir comes knocking and says, we want another contract of £50 million or of £200 million, we sign those contracts because suddenly the infrastructure has completely shifted to facilitate not the needs of people who are in a crushingly difficult situation with the NHS, which is already at the brink of collapsing, but we're shifting resources over to a rogue tech company that has a track record of human rights violations in the United States and who we're helping gain ground here in Europe.
Just looking ahead a little bit, Elon Musk has just been appointed by Donald Trump as the co-chair of the newly proposed Department of Government Efficiency, which I'm definitely going to read as DOGE. Many people listening to this might think, dear God, we urgently need regulation of the tech industry. And if you don't, you weren't paying attention.
Right.
Are you hopeful about the direction of travel?
trying to force myself to be. I think that there are a few things that are emerging out of this situation that are somewhat promising. One is there was a lot of investment, as there should have been, I think, by advocates and by especially, tech rights people in trying to get the previous administration, the incumbent administration, to move on things like AI and to ensure that there were safeguards in place, that there were human rights protections in place. The Federal Trade Commission under the current leadership has been quite strong in terms of holding at bay some of the big tech companies. What we're likely to see is a sort of a recidivism that's likely to manifest in less being done at a federal level. What that does mean is that it opens the opportunity for activism at the local level that actually can be quite meaningful and contribute to a lot of gains that we saw also during the last Trump administration at the city level and at the state level, which might not otherwise, have the time and effort and capacity invested in it because we're too concerned with the federal. So what we saw, for example, in the last administration was that some of the bans that were being proposed on facial recognition at city levels, from Portland to Somerville to San Francisco, actually went through the city councils because the city councilors, as well as the advocates that were fighting the good fight, as it were, especially on the back of surveillance becoming more of an issue after the murder of George Floyd,
right,
suddenly were more powerful and successful and more ready to tackle that issue there. So I am hopeful in the sense that a divestment, to some extent, unintentional as it may be, from the federal level is going to mean that our immediate communities and our cities and our states are going to see more of a development in the right direction. But that's not justifying at all the administration and the change and the sort of horrific downward effects that we will see as a result of the lack of accountability and the cutting of many of the protections that were put in place previously.
Yeah.
And it's also not to rubber stamp and give space to the incumbent administration is particularly good on matters of tech or Gaza for that matter, because you are dealing with a much of a muchness. It changes where tactically we go.
Well, that leads me nicely to my last question, which is that in the context of AI, it being the fastest growing sector globally, what would you advise to listeners to this show who are concerned about the threats to privacy and frankly to our freedom from these companies? How do we resist, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, where we resist really matters and is subject to obviously where we find ourselves. In the UK, I'd say, relying on MPs and policymakers on pushing them really to work on prohibitions on some of the worst technologies that we also know are wound up with what we're witnessing in Gaza and the Palestinian territories at large, is a really good first step. And that means writing to the MPs and informing them about these systems. We have resources on this on Amnesty sites as well. And so pushing them for a ban of not just facial recognition, drones, mass surveillance tools, but also the export of these tools, right? Because they go hand in hand. If you can't allow a technology being used here because of the profound human rights implications that they have, we cannot look each other in the straight face and say that these technologies should be permissible in a context just because there is war, especially when that war is on the basis of, again, particular politics that are wound up with ongoing apartheid and unfolding genocide. But the technologies that are wound up in enabling them also must be stopped.
And presumably boycott, divest and sanction.
Yes.
Matt, thank you so much. Well, thank you for all your insights, first of all, but also thank you for all the incredible work that you and your colleagues do at Amnesty International. We appreciate you greatly. If this conversation made you think, don't stop here. Hit subscribe on YouTube and follow us on Instagram and TikTok to stay in the loop. Thank you again to our guest, Matt Mahmoudi, and thank you all for watching. Join us again next week for more tea on the issues that matter.